Welcome back to all of you. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Did you have time to stretch your legs? Maybe having a Spanish siesta? I'm just kidding. Not too much time for this. But for sure, time for networking here physically, and of course, and I hope so, by using the app we have ready for you. So now, time to carry on with our keynote of the day, and we are going to talk about co-designing the future of health. In the past 18 months, we have radically shifted how we deliver healthcare. While many innovations used today seem new or novel, the truth is patients have been asking them for years. So, what trends do the future hold? Let's ask the patients to find it out. Today, we are going to talk to Jen Horonjeff. She's founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative. Jen has named one of the 50 most daring entrepreneurs by Entrepreneur magazine for her work at Savvy. Jen grew up with multiple autoimmune diseases, survived a brain tumor, holds a PhD in environmental medicine, and is a health outcomes researcher, human factors engineer, and FDA advisor. So, Jen, from US, so good afternoon here, good morning for you. It's a pleasure to having you here. Thank you very much for your time.
You were actually joined by my colleague, Jahed, who is with you in person. So he looks exactly like me. He does not. But thank you so much for having me. This is something very near and dear to my heart, to be able to talk to you about the patient journey. So I'm going to spend some time telling you a little bit about my own personal experiences as I have been introduced as a patient. And that is something I identify with first and foremost. And it's because I was diagnosed as an infant with juvenile idiopathic arthritis and a lot of other autoimmune diseases since then, both rare and more common. So I've really been living that patient experience since day one. I had the joy of being diagnosed with a brain tumor that was surgically removed about 9 years ago. And so at this point, I've really had a whole swath of different experiences. And I'm going to tell you about little vignettes that have happened along the way that help to exemplify what so many of my peers as patients we go through day to day, and how we can use those experiences to help you all create better products and services, because nobody wants to improve healthcare more than the patients. And so we really want to partner with you to do that. And the most helpful thing is understanding what it is we go through. So as somebody who lives with arthritis, I've had to go through a lot of various different tests, as well as tried a lot of the new medications as they came out into the market. And the thing that I started to feel is that at every juncture, there just started to be more and more barriers for me as a patient to try to take care of my own health. And that's why in healthcare, when people talk about non-compliance, it's really a challenge for me as a patient to reconcile that with the fact that I'm trying my darndest to do what my care plan is telling me to do, but it's all of these different friction points. So I'll give you some examples. So years ago, I ended up having just horrible disease of my arthritis in both of my hips. And my rheumatologist said, we need to get an MRI first so that we know what to do to put you on the right medication. So she ordered me an MRI. Now, I live in the United States, so our healthcare system is a little bit different here. But that meant for me that I actually had to get prior authorization from my health insurance before I could get my imaging done. And what was a really urgent thing to my rheumatologist and to me as a patient, it was not urgent to my insurance. And so I ended up waiting 2 weeks before I could get that approval to get my scans done. So flash forward then, I get my scans done and get prescribed a medication. But this medication, one of these biologics, I actually couldn't go on until I had failed other medications first. Now, I had been on other biologics before, but because of changing health insurance, it actually meant that I needed to start all over again. And this is not what my provider tried to prescribe me. It's not what I, as a patient, knew I needed to try something different. But again, I had no control. And that's what it feels like for so many patients, is we're trying and we just can't get the care that we need. So this is actually a different medication, but one of the biologics that I was then prescribed created a whole new set of issues when I finally did get the medication. Now, if you're a patient like me, you've been injecting yourself with different biologic medications for decades now. But there was one particular medication that the needle came in the syringe, but the needle felt so blunt. The best I can describe it is trying to inject yourself with like a blunt pencil that you just couldn't quite get into your skin. And it would literally kind of like bounce off my stomach or my arm whenever I would try to inject it, which created a lot of anxiety for somebody who is very comfortable with needles. But it just always, I had to psych myself up to try to jam this thing in that just didn't want to go into my skin. Let me tell you, that is not an ideal patient experience. Another story that I find quite interesting is, as was introduced, I'm a human factors engineer by training. And when I was in graduate school, it was actually my department that was testing out a new design of a new syringe. It was meant to be an incredible patient experience because this new syringe had a longer arm for the patient to hold. It had a different way of pulling off the cap. It was going to be just the best different type of injection. Well, everybody in my graduate program knew that I had inflammatory arthritis, and I had hoped that I would be part of this project to test out this new syringe. I wasn't, and that's okay. But flash forward a few years later, and I was prescribed this medication. I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be the best injection of my life because they've designed it well. Well, turns out when I get this new syringe with all the fancy new enhancements, I couldn't hold it properly. And the reason why, I believe, is that somebody without arthritis, without taking these types of medications, was probably the one testing it out. And biologics, you can inject in different places, and be it stomach, leg, and arm. And now they've stopped recommending the arm so much. But if you're from the older guard, an older generation like myself, that's where so many of us like to inject, especially if we have to do it regularly. Many patients don't like to inject their legs because it bruises so easily. So we rotate through stomachs and arms. But if you all sit there and you think, oh gosh, how is my hand holding this device if I'm going to go for my stomach versus my leg versus my arm? Your hand actually changes and your wrist changes. And because this new arm was developed on the syringe, it made it so those of us that were trying to inject our stomach and our arms couldn't hold it properly. And so this whole innovation that had spent time and money was not useful. I couldn't even use it the way it was intended. Now, here's the real kicker. Even if they had tested that part out properly, now with this longer arm, it would not fit in the sharps container that I was provided. So here I was, a patient, finally giving myself an injection, in other types of injections with these blunt needles, and then I go to put it in my sharps container and it won't fit. So I get a pile of syringes that I would collect in a Ziploc bag and bring to my rheumatologist. This is not how it was intended to go. But unless we understand the entire patient journey, we're going to keep running into these things unless patients are helping us identify some of these problems. Now, this is happening in the health data and digital health space as well. There was one time when I had waited about 6 months to get in with a new specialist. I was so excited. I was finally going to try to get the care that I needed. And it was about a week before my appointment, and that doctor's office called and said, we need to get your health records from your other providers. I said, no problem. I have my whole patient portal here on my phone. I've got all my apps. And they said, no, we need your whole record. And you as a patient don't have it. Only the doctor in their office in the health system in the United States has that record. We as the patients don't see the doctor's notes, maybe just our lab results or our COVID-19 vaccine proof, but we don't see everything. And so here, again, in the United States, we're still using fax machines to get our health records. And what this meant for me as a patient is I had to call my other providers, fax them over the authorization to share my records, and then have a CD with my data sent to me. And I don't even have a CD-ROM on my computer, so I had no way to read it. Let me tell you, this took so long that I missed my appointment. I had to reschedule the specialty appointment I had waited 6 months to get because I couldn't get the data that I needed. I thought I was being the most, prepared and informed patient. I work in health technology and healthcare, but I couldn't overcome this. What happens to other patients that don't even have, the same access and privilege that I do? What are their experiences? And let me tell you, I don't even know what all of them are. And I think that's important for us all to remember, is that we can't think that we understand the patient experiences of other patients, that we aren't a part of their communities. And so that's something, as we start to develop out new, innovations, we really need to be thoughtful about the different experiences, be it the country differences that I might be talking about with some of you, be it the therapeutic area differences, or those that come from underserved communities that don't really have a seat at the table. So we're not hearing their voices. So long in healthcare, we've even just sort of ignored the patient voice because there are so many other stakeholders involved. But what happens then? Earlier this year, as many people do at the beginning of the year, they make predictions about the latest trends. And so this past year, I was seeing, come January, people were talking about how hot digital health was. And of course, telemedicine is taking over, the fact that the pandemic has forced us to do things virtually. And I sat here reading trend after trend and each different report rolling out. And I was just thinking, my goodness, patients have been talking about this forever. Decentralized trials, how novel that was. Patients have been wanting to be able to participate from trials remotely for years. They've wondered, why do I have to go into a site? Why do I have to pick up my life and travel and relocate to go to a center that just happens to be doing the clinical trial? Why can't I do it from my home or my local clinic? Why can't I be using telehealth to connect with my providers, especially if it's just a quick check-in? Why do I need to get up, take time off from work, find childcare, and go to an appointment where the doctor may only spend 5 minutes with me? All of these things patients have been asking for. We just haven't been listening because we didn't have the same incentive to listen to them. But now that the world is turned upside down, we really need to start listening, especially if we care about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected certain communities, and it's finally allowing more people to see the health inequities that exist. But the good news is that there are things that we can do about it, but we can't take action until we understand what those experiences are. And so I'm hoping that now, as the world is starting to come back to life, either in person or in these virtual spaces, that we can see that there are opportunities that we can learn, even from an event like this. That you all get to be there in person, but I get to chime in virtually. And that's what so many patients want. They want options. They want to be able to pick the right thing for them and their families. I get asked a lot, like, what do patients think about this, that, or the other thing? And I try to remind people, I am one individual. Patients are not monolith. There are so many different priorities between patients, between their care partners or family members that may also have different priorities that certainly differ from what a provider or a sponsor or a health plan is thinking about too. And so when we think about how can we create a more inclusive healthcare ecosystem, we really want to start to think about working with those patients to get their input into what we're doing. And here at Savvy Cooperative, we've really been grateful that we've worked with so many companies over the past year and a half to help them rethink, what does healthcare of the future look like? And how can we include patients in that conversation? And it's been incredible to be part of designing some of these things that are hopefully going to become ubiquitous. This past year, we've been spending a lot of time working with AstraZeneca to help them understand how can we rethink decentralized trials and supporting patients from home. AstraZeneca has really done the work to think about how can they develop out different support for patients. How can they end up testing out their new app that's going to help patients along the way? Thinking through what kind of information does a patient want, at which times, and through which channels. It's been great to see them actually make tangible changes that is going to make the patient experience in trials not only less cumbersome, but feel more supportive and safe, especially if the patient is participating so much from home. We've been able to work with Boehringer Ingelheim on working on a lot of initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. They've set up a diversity and inclusion patient council, which we've been helping to facilitate, so that when BI has questions and they want to make sure they're thinking through all of these different things, they have a team of patients that they can turn to, that they can say with vulnerability, we don't have the answer, but we want to include patients in the conversation to help us figure it out. And when we think about diversity, this of course can be race and ethnicity. It can be around gender, sexual orientation, age. So many different things factor into this. And one of the recent conversations that we were having was around even thinking about how is data being analyzed in these different groups? Because people even care about what that is. And so we really need to be thoughtful and have these conversations so people feel safe. We've been doing a lot of work in even digital therapeutics because there's so many more that are coming online now, but we need to get that perspective. And as somebody who's grown up with a pediatric illness, it made me very happy when we worked with Achille to help them think through their digital therapeutic for children with ADHD. Just because they're kids doesn't mean that they can't share their perspectives. And so we were grateful to be a part of that and helping them facilitate those conversations. There are so many different ways that we can be leveraging different types of technology in this space. Even the types of technology we might not think about can be supportive for patients if it's inclusive. Recently, Amazon just released a new feature to allow patients with stutter and stammer to be more readily heard and included in using something like an Alexa. And we were grateful to be a part of helping them get that feedback because we can't create innovations if it's going to leave people out. We need to be really thinking about who else are we not hearing from? And if we don't hear their voices and include them in the conversations, we'll never know what they're needing. And I'm going to leave you with thinking about who is included in these conversations. I have the absolute privilege of speaking with you today, but I recognize the privilege that I come from, being somebody working in healthcare, who has a PhD, lives in New York City, comes from a certain background. And I want us to be challenged to understand that when we think about including people, it's not just only from different communities, it's also thinking about health literacy. And are we only talking to higher level patient advocates because they can speak our language? Or are we doing the work to make sure we're including people that don't know what a clinical trial is, has never thought about having their Apple Watch, linked to their patient portal? How can we make sure that just because they don't have maybe the same language that we're all talking about these things doesn't mean that their voices and their perspectives are any less important? If we truly want to create a more patient-centered future, which I do believe if you are at this meeting that you care about that, we need to include the patients. We need to do what this handy sign behind me says, which is ask patients. I started off with this and I'm going to end with this. Believe me, nobody wants to improve healthcare more than the patients that are trying to manage their conditions while navigating through this process. So include us in the conversation because we're going to get there faster if we can work together. I thank you so much for your time, and I'm excited to see what kind of questions you have. I know we're working in this virtual environment, so I'm getting some beamed into me right now. I'll take a peek, but certainly if you have any other questions, please let us know. All right, here's one from the audience. I'm going to read it to you in real time. The patient journey of the future is not going to be a singular journey, as you said in your talk. What are actionable ways that you've seen in the market, such as AstraZeneca's work, for those of us building products to ensure that patient journey is diverse and inclusive? That's a great question. And this is the whole thing, is there's also no recipe for patient engagement. It can look differently depending on where you are in your sort of product development. Sometimes you're looking to go to a broader group of patients. And that's where I think people usually jump to thinking, oh, I'll send out a survey. But surveys, especially if they're larger surveys, can be more quantitative in nature. And quantitative data generally gives us a signal that something is wrong, but it doesn't tell us how to fix it. So what Savvy does a lot of is we work more in the qualitative space, the more richer conversations with patients to help troubleshoot some of these things of understanding, why would you not doing something? What's happening? And so that's where I think understanding where you are in the process, you might want to go for a larger sample, and then you have some questions and you're going to spend time doing some interviews or different types of forums, getting direct feedback from patients. When we do things and support companies that are maybe getting into a new therapeutic area, first and foremost, we have so many conversations with patients to understand just like, what are your experiences? And it's really important to not bias them with a solution, to be like, hey, do you like this app? We're not even there yet. We need to make sure that we're teasing out some of these different things before we're kind of in solution mode. But then, like I mentioned before with AstraZeneca, with things like digital therapeutics, there then comes a time when you want to put these things directly in front of patients, be it a prototype for them to actually test out and say, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do here. This is really confusing. Why is it asking me this? This should be mixed and going first. So all these different things. We even do this in marketing campaigns. If you're trying to recruit for patients in clinical trials and the materials make no sense to them, that's not helpful either. So there's always an opportunity to ask patients. All right, let me see what else we have here. For those who manage resources to invest in these ecosystems, such as pharma and health and hospital systems, what is the value of patient diversity and inclusion to the stakeholders building the journeys for patients? This is a great question too, because truthfully, there is a business and a value proposition for those like the hospital systems, for the pharmaceutical companies, you name it. Obviously, from the patient lens, I'm thinking first and foremost for the patient, but I understand that there has to be a business case for this. But even if you think about something like a clinical trial, we know that amendments to the protocol slow the entire trial down and end up making it last years longer, which changes the net present value when it hits the market. And so if we actually did the work up front to talk to patients to understand, what is this protocol? Is it too burdensome for them to stay into? How can we look at that before we launch the trial? And so that way we can save so much time. In health systems, people are trying to think about patient engagement and how can we keep the patient more involved in their care, not missing appointments, all of these different types of things. I mentioned many in sort of my opening statements that there were so many things that I, as a patient, couldn't follow my treatment plan. I had to cancel appointments because the system wasn't working together. So those are different ways that you can make the business case for why it's important to include patients. here in the United States, we work a lot in sort of the Medicaid and Medicare population. And it's something that we hear about all the time is how can we make sure that this certain community is also feeling engaged? Otherwise, we're going to lose, a lot of people from the system. And so I'll bring it back in my closing seconds here just to say it's for the patients. They want to have health back. And so it's really important to make sure that we're working with them so we can create the best future together. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much, Jen. What an emotional presentation, don't you think? Thank you. Thank you again for your time, for your participation.